As was mentioned, I'm Corey Peters. I'm the Chief SharePoint Architect at Eastridge and also run the SharePoint practice. And we're going to be talking about building custom applications in the cloud. So we're going to start going over a brief description of composite apps. This is something that Microsoft has talked about since SharePoint 2010, but it's even becoming increasingly powerful because of the cloud and because we have less code options in the cloud. We can't write server-side code in Office 365. And so we can snap some of these pieces together now that we have new service applications like Visio services and extended functionality with Excel services. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. We've written a little help desk sample kind of scenario, and we're going to go through that. We can show you the code. We can talk about what we did and how we snapped some pieces together. And then we're going to get into a really more detailed walkthrough of that example application so we can actually kind of dig in deeper into the code there. So what's a composite application? Why are they important? Why do they matter? What are the tools that are involved in composite apps? So we're going to answer all those questions. Microsoft calls a composite application, this is the definition, right? But ultimately we're talking about combining data, documents, business processes, assembling, connecting, configuring. You notice I didn't put developing here, but we're going to kind of add that to this session through SharePoint apps. To rapidly build and create business solutions. So that's what this is about. It's about taking these pieces like Lego blocks and snapping them together and building solutions. It's something that you can give to an end user or something that we can do as developers as well. All right. So this is just a Gartner quote here. Everybody's heard of Gartner, and they published a press release. They said 25% of applications by 2014 are going to be built by the end user, by the business. So this is already happening. We've already had, access databases run rampant on file shares and too much business process being done in Excel spreadsheets. This is already kind of, I think, probably a low number if you were to kind of look back, right? So end user application developer. This is a new acronym, I think, that kind of Gartner maybe is coined here, but this is the EUAD. 25% of business applications we built from them. So the challenge that we have is how do we control that? How do we manage it, right? And the solution, I think, is this IT-sanctioned runtime environment. We as IT have to provide to the business the tools. We have to enable the business. We can't just kind of be a blocking force and say, no, you need to put an IT request. We're going to build that app, or we're going to go buy something. We have to put some tools in their hands and enable them. But we also have to have the right governance and the right support. If they just go out and build access databases and drop them on file shares, we're right back where we were 5 years ago. So we need some better solutions for that. And what we're proposing in this presentation is that Office 365 and SharePoint is the platform, is the IT-sanctioned runtime environment. These tools that you can snap together are manageable, they're cloud-based, and they aren't going to have the same kind of file locking scenarios that Access had. So the IT-sanctioned runtime environment looks something like this. It's Access services, it's SharePoint, Word, it's InfoPath, it's PowerPoint services, Excel services, OneNote, Visio services. It's developing apps using the client-side object model and using the new app model in 2013. It's some of the new Power BI functionality, which if you haven't heard of this is something that Microsoft just announced at the SharePoint conference. They're taking the Power View, Power Pivot, and some of these other pieces, and they're rolling it into a suite of tools called Power BI. And it's going to be launching on SharePoint Office 365. So Power BI is going to include new functionality called Power Map and Power Query. This is data visualization tool, so you can take data from an Excel spreadsheet and overlay it on top of a Bing map, and you can see 3D representations of that data. All inside of Excel and all publishable to SharePoint Online. So very cool. It has a whole server-side service layer with it as well as part of Office 365. And they've just released about a week ago a Windows 8 app where you can take those same reports you build in Power BI and view them on your Windows 8 or your Surface or your tablet. So they're really kind of moving towards mobile consumption of this data, and it's pretty cool stuff there. But this IT-sanctioned runtime environment should also include governance. It should include master data governance. It should include metadata. It should have some systems and process and IT governance. All the kind of best practices there that we can control because this is a cloud-based service. All right. So any kind of questions about, I guess, the idea of composite apps and how we're positioning them? All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about this help desk application. What we've done is we've taken 3 different components and built a little solution here. This is actually like a web part page. This is a screenshot from a SharePoint page. We have 3 distinct pieces. We have a Visio diagram. We have just some HTML content that's just been put into the page, and we have an app part. So this is actually a web part. Open tickets is the web part header, and this is the kind of the web part body there. So the 3 different pieces that we have going on is we have this Excel survey. This is using a functionality in SharePoint Online. You can actually build anonymous surveys in Excel using Excel services. So I'll show you that. It's pretty neat. That survey drives a Visio diagram. So this is a data-bound Visio document bound to the Excel document. Okay. So as people complete satisfaction surveys, this Visio diagram updates in real time. You'll see that when we go through the demo, but it's going to show the total number, and it's going to show things like the number of missed SLAs. So I'll show you the Visio and the Excel document. But what we've done is we've put some rules into the Excel document to say if the survey response is bad, if somebody says I'm not satisfied with the help I got, then we're going to consider that a missed SLA. But if they were very satisfied or satisfied, then we'll consider that meets the SLA, right? So we have 2 questions in the survey, one for on-site and one for phone-based remote support, and that's how we're kind of tracking that. So we've just done some very simple Excel logic, but this is driving a dashboard. If I had to build this dashboard in HTML and JavaScript and write some code for that, it'd probably take me a week to get it looking like this, all nice. This took me about 20 minutes to do, snapping these pieces together. So very simple. So just kind of talk through the pieces. Now I just want to show it to you in SharePoint so we can actually click through it and see it actually live here. So I'm going to put this out on my other screen. So this is our SharePoint site. You can see it's in Office 365. We're actually at eastridge.sharepoint.com. We're in the cloud. So we have our Visio web part, and we have our app part on the right-hand side. So if I was to edit this page, and I'm not seeing it on my screen, so hopefully, here we go. So hopefully, so now we can see this. It's really just a Visio web access web part, and we have our app part here. They work just like normal web parts. All right. This app part, it's nothing more than a fancy iframe. Okay, so that's how Microsoft has the new app model. This web part is just iframing some content that we've built, and I'll show you a little bit more about how it works later. But there's really no, just like SharePoint's built upon IIS and all the standard web development practices, all of these new things with client-side are built upon standard client-side development practices. So this is just a nice iframe here. So that's the page. So let's do a few things. Let's add a new ticket. So I'll just say new ticket here. This opened up in a new window, so I'm just going to move it over here. And we're just using a standard SharePoint list item. So this is an app that has been packaged into a 2013 app model. It's been packaged into a little file. It's been deployed through our centralized app catalog in SharePoint. So an app catalog is a site collection in 2013 that you can upload apps to, and then end users can go into their sites and they can install your app from that catalog. So it gives you a way to actually centrally deploy customizations within SharePoint 2013. So whereas before you might have maybe built a farm-based solution and deployed it out, and everybody has that customization kind of touching them. Now you can say, and we had sandbox solutions in 2010, but they were hard to deploy. You had to go to the site collection, upload the sandbox, and activate it. Now in 2013, we can go to a central place, an app catalog, and we can upload this app. And now if a user comes in to the site here, let me just go back and I'll show you. They go to site contents, they click add an app. Your applications actually show up here. So here's a SharePoint app too. This is in our catalog. This is a custom app that we've built. So any application that you build within your organization, it can be something as simple as like managing a meeting room or reserving, or maybe it's a time off or like a PTO request. Maybe it just shows a little bit of news and you want that news to be sourced from some central location. You can really build an app for anything. Anything you could do as a web part, you can build as an app in 2013. But now you can empower the user and say, hey, I've got this little bit of functionality. Would you like it on your site? So in this case, we've done that here as a ticketing system. So let me we'll just walk through kind of how the app works so we can have some understanding of it when we go into the detail. So I'm going to add a new issue. I'm going to say my screen will not share to the projector. I'll add my name here. And I'll make it a high priority because I've got doing my meeting right now. And no description, I'll just save it. So you'll see when I clicked on that add a new ticket, I actually opened it up in a new window. And I needed to do that because this is an iframe. I could have shown it inline inside the iframe, but I don't have a whole lot of real estate in that area. So that's why I chose to do that, just as a simple solution for the demo here. So let's refresh the page. And what you'll see is our app's loading, going and fetching the data, and now this list item shows. Doesn't seem like a whole lot, but all of that code was written in JavaScript. So the communication to go talk to the SharePoint list, get the list of items, bind it to the HTML, and build that table, all that was done in client-side JavaScript. So a little neat thing I can do here is I can actually start a network trace within Internet Explorer, hit refresh, and we can actually watch that JavaScript happen kind of over the wire. So if I scroll down here, try to find it while I'm staring at it here. And here's our SharePoint app. The SharePoint app URLs always have these kind of crazy little characters and numbers in here. So we've generated a unique ID. And this is all the communication that's happening with our SharePoint app. You can see it's going and getting all of our app CSS. It's going and getting all the additional resources it needs. And it's also communicating with that process query. So here's an actual JSON request that was actually done over the wire just to go get that data back from the list. But it all is happening from the client. So my browser actually went out and requested the data and actually created that list. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that we can still do that kind of development customizations, even though this is a simple solution in the cloud with no server-side code. So really very much the future of kind of this shared cloud-based environment. That code is never going to break anybody else's SharePoint server. Even if that code runs poorly, it might crash my browser, but it's not going to crash the server. It's not going to slow down the shared infrastructure. So that's kind of the direction Microsoft's heading. Okay, so we've added a ticket. Now let's complete a customer satisfaction survey. So when I create the item here, I get this nice Excel survey. If anybody's used Google Docs, and I know it's a kind of a taboo word here at Microsoft, but if anybody uses that, Google's had surveys and Google surveys for a while, and it pipes those results into a spreadsheet. That's what Microsoft's done here. They've enabled this in SkyDrive, the public offering, and now they've brought this into SharePoint Online as well. So Excel surveys give you the ability to anonymously fill out a quick little form. So I can just say, yes, I'm very satisfied. This is really great help. And I'll submit, response received, and I can close that window. So that's really, sorry, let me go back to my page here. So that's all that it took. Now, what happened behind the scenes is we have an Excel document in a SharePoint document library, no fancy magic there, that has the ticket survey. Down here on our survey tab, a new line item came in and it said very satisfied. That's all that's happened. So the survey form that got built, I didn't customize that form, I just added the questions. Microsoft handles all that. They handle taking that survey and making it anonymously accessible to the internet. And they handle pushing the data back into my list. If I looked at the SharePoint list item, you'd see that the editor was guest contributor because it was anonymous, right? So all that works by magic in SharePoint Online. It's pretty cool. The other thing I want to show you is, and we'll get into the Visio a little bit more, but the Visio diagram is really just Visio shapes bound to Excel data. So has anybody here bound Excel data to Visio before or done anything like that? So, yeah, a few people? Okay, very good. So we'll talk a little bit about that if you haven't seen that before. So before we dive into the code, let's talk a little bit more about the architecture just so we're on the same page. So we have Excel services. Inside Excel services, we're using that Excel survey functionality. That gives us kind of a data connection to Excel, right? We have an Excel spreadsheet that we can get that data from. We're using Visio services. We have the Visio services web part, and we have data-driven shapes within that Visio diagram. So we're extracting the data from Excel and binding it to our shapes in Visio, and that's how we're building that dashboard. One of the new features with 2013 is that in 2010 you used to have to make a VDW. If anybody's worked with that, it's like a Visio data web file. You don't have to do that anymore. There's a new file format for Visio that has the syntax in the end, so it's like VSDX, and you don't have to build a special file type. Every Visio document is just cloud ready, and it's ready for these Visio Services web parts. So that's kind of nice. The next piece is our SharePoint app, right? So our SharePoint app has 3 pieces. It has a list, just a SharePoint list that we're storing tickets in. I showed you the new form a second ago, and we added an item to that list. It has an app part. That's the little iframed component that we saw. And it has an app page. Every app has an app page. That's like the default page. If someone was to click on your app, they'll go to the app page. And there's really nothing fancy about our app page. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Ours just looks like this. It's welcome and has a link to the list. It could just be the about. It could be the the disclaimer page. It doesn't really have to be anything fancy, but every app must have an app page. And the last part we have is our SharePoint web page. So that web page has the Visio dashboard, it has our app part, and it has the HTML link to the Excel survey. So that's kind of how all these pieces are connected. All right. So we're going to spend most of the time digging into the detailed walkthrough. So if you want to build something like this, what would you do? You'd have to enable Excel Services survey support. This is kind of a little tricky. Actually, it works by default in your My Site with SharePoint Online, but you actually don't see the option if you try to do this in SharePoint Online normally. You have to go into the tenant administration and turn on anonymous access for your site collection and tell it that you allow guest contributors, with non-authenticated. As soon as you do that, Excel surveys suddenly start working. So we actually blogged about this. So if you're interested, we went ahead and shared that information out there. So then you need to build your Excel survey. So I showed you what the final products look like, and we'll go through a little bit more about kind of how we build these things. You need to create the Visio diagram, and you need to connect that Visio to the Excel. So I'll show you how you import data. And then we need to configure the Visio, bind all the data to it, and we need to build that custom app. I imagine most people, what we found kind of yesterday is a lot of people were interested around this bullet, right? How do we build custom apps in SharePoint Online? Client-side development is still fairly new. People are still kind of investigating SharePoint 2013, and so how do we actually build that stuff? So let's talk about a few of these things. Excel surveys are SharePoint Online only. They're not supported in SharePoint on-premise, just kind of a FYI. This is kind of Microsoft's cloud-first mentality. They're doing this with Power BI that I mentioned before. Everything's going cloud first, and then they're going to roll the functionality on-premise. You'll see the same thing, the same strategy with Yammer as we start to get more integration there too. So everything's cloud first. So first thing you need to do is enable that external access. This is what you have to click here. Allow both external users who accept sharing invitations and anonymous guest links. The survey uses an anonymous guest link. That's why you have to turn this on. So just keep in mind this does have security implications. It will allow users to share documents externally without people having to sign in. It doesn't just impact surveys, it also impacts all documents and content. So just be aware of that. And it's a per site collection setting in SharePoint Online. Once you do that, when you hit this new document menu, you'll see a new option called Excel Survey. And you'll be able to create a Excel survey in the cloud. The Excel surveys are only editable through Excel web app. You can't open Excel on your desktop and start building a survey. You have to do it through Excel web app. Okay, so let's look at building an Excel survey real quick. So in order to do this, I just need to go to my document library. And I'm going to click New Document and then Excel Survey here. And it's going to ask me for a file name. I'll just say Sample Survey. Click OK. All right. So yesterday it actually crashed on this page, so I'm glad it's fixed. So here's the first question. And this is really simple surveys. If you've worked with a survey list in SharePoint, you have branching logic and you have all that kind of stuff. This doesn't have that. It's keep it simple. Let's just do some different types of options. We can do paragraphs and multi-choice. We can do yes, no. But it's very, very simple stuff. And so we can just add a few questions here. Nice interface for this. And we can say save and view the survey. Or we can share it. By sharing the survey, it's going to provide us that anonymous guest link for filling it out. So if I just copy this, say close, and I go back to my site here. Now I have an Excel document, but if I also want to test that URL, I have my survey link. So that's really all there is to it. So that's the Excel survey. So some really, really interesting use cases open up with this. This could be a survey directly to customers that marketing could attach to their emails. This could be something that you want to use internally to capture feedback. But it's just piped into an Excel document. So it's really easy to do analysis on this content later. So some pretty cool stuff there. All right. Very good. Any questions about Excel surveys? I mean, this is these are, like I mentioned, these are pieces that we snap together, right? So some of these pieces are more complex than others, but the fact that they're there, the fact that we can integrate a really nice Excel survey into an existing application, collecting feedback is really critical, and having a feedback loop, no matter what you're doing, whether you're rolling out a custom piece of software or whether you're rolling out an intranet or whatever it might be, that feedback loop is important. And sending an email and putting a contact email and say, send us your feedback, is not always the best way to kind of collect that information. So this could be a really simple way just to put a quick feedback loop in for your app. So building a Visio, data-driven Visio, you have to start with a Visio document, and then once you get that document open, you can say data, link data to shapes, and that is going to start a wizard. The first option in the wizard is going to be Excel document, and you're just going to literally paste in the URL to the Excel document in SharePoint. That's all you have to do. It will bring the data in. It will show it as a nice little table, and you can just drag and drop it to attach that data to shapes. So I'll kind of walk you through that really quickly. Let's just grab our URL here. I'm just going to say, I'm actually going to click this, and here's our URL here. So I'm just going to copy that. A little bit easier in 2013 to copy URLs. Even if you just right-click and copy the URL on the item, it actually gets a pretty clean URL compared to what it used to do in 2010. So nice little usability. Let's open up Visio. So here's Visio. Say a blank drawing. Create that. And I'm going to say data and link data to shapes. First option is Excel workbook. So I'll say next. Next. I'll paste in my URL that I grabbed from SharePoint. I'll take out that web equals 1. Actually, you know what? I grabbed the Visio diagram, didn't I? Let's grab this one here. Okay, great. So now hit next. So it's going to go talk to SharePoint. It's actually going to connect through Excel services. So all of this is kind of built into the application integration. So when you're working with, whether it's Word, Excel, PowerPoint services, these applications seem to be very well integrated, much better than they were in the past. So a lot of the Microsoft apps have started to release on the same cycle, which has kind of tightened up that integration. All right, so now we've got some data here, and you can see I have two sheets. I have sheet 1 and survey. The survey is the actual survey results. Sheet 1 is actually a sheet that I've built that has just some calculated columns in it saying, give me a row count, how many people said that they were very satisfied. Do a row count on that, and I put that into a table. So let me show you what that looks like. I've got 3 columns. I have an ID field, I have a metric value, like label, and I have a value. It's important to have an ID column if you're doing this, because otherwise what this will do is it'll say, I'm going to, when the data refreshes, I'm going to assume the row is unique based on its order, and sometimes the order can change in a table, and then it's going to get your data all mixed up. So you really need to have some kind of unique identifier so Visio can remap that data. All right. So now we have a nice little table right down here at the bottom. Just make this a little bit larger. And I need a shape. So I'm just going to search for the smiley face. Drag him over here. Now we got a nice smiley face. And I have a metric here that says on-site meeting SLA. I'll just literally just drag and drop that onto my smiley face. Okay. Now it shows me that I have 4 survey responses that are meeting the SLA. That's pretty good. That would give me a dashboard, but I can actually refine this by editing the data graphic, and I'll remove the metric. Don't need that. That's actually the ID. I want to change that to value because I really want to see the value. So if I just do that, now I see value 4. That's pretty good. But I can also go in and change the styling on this to be a little bit nicer. So maybe I want it to be a nice green circle. and I'd like this to be a 20-point font. And just through a couple clicks, I can now see a much nicer little metric indicator. So you can really build some pretty nice kind of charts and BI tools, really just quite quickly with just a few clicks. So that's all we've done. We've done that exact same process to build this Excel survey file here. So I'll just open this in Visio for you. So this is opening on my other screen, so give it 1 second. Okay, here it is. And you can see these are just kind of standard shapes here, nothing special about that. I've got the same bindings done. So I've bound to a smiley and a frowny face based on whether it's missed or hit the SLA. So that's it, no special magic there. Okay. All right, so adding a Visio web part, pretty simple. Insert the web part into the page. Not going to cover this in too much detail. It is in the business data category, and it is the Visio web access web part. You do need to make sure that you have your Visio service application configured and running if you're going to do this on premise, but it is possible. These are the settings that I set on the web part. I think this is a little bit important because things like disable panning and disable zoom, they're just annoying. If you're trying to scroll down the page and you have your mouse over the Visio web part, you'll suddenly zoom into the web part. And so it's just annoying to work with. And so what I found is that setting fit all shapes in view, that will fit it to the web part width, and disabling and enabling some of these features are really the best experience if you're going to try to build like a nice dashboard. So just kind of a real quick heads up there. Okay, so let's talk about apps for SharePoint. SharePoint has three modes for apps. You have the hosted app. That's what we've done in this demo, and that's the code that we'll show you. It's all JavaScript, and what happens is you have your SharePoint site, and the app actually comes in as a sub-web. So it actually builds a sub-site just for the app. Okay? So if you have 100 apps, you're going to have 100 sub-webs off of your site. Now, they're special webs. They're very simple. Don't have a whole lot of bells and whistles. They really only have the lists and libraries that you deploy as part of your app. So they're very, very lightweight. But in this case, we're writing JavaScript that's actually hosted inside that app web for that piece. The other option is your server side. If you still need to write C#, we got a lot of C# guys and server side developers here. If you still need to do that, you have two options. You can have a developer-hosted app, or you can have an Azure auto-provisioned app. This is SharePoint Online only. Okay, so this option here for Azure is SharePoint Online only, but on-premise, we can do this. So what actually happens is we have the SharePoint web, but we have an IIS site running outside of SharePoint. It can be a whole other server. It can be running Apache. It can be running Java. It doesn't matter. Microsoft actually doesn't care. You're going to communicate to SharePoint using client-side object model, using web services, using whatever you need, the pieces that Microsoft has given you, REST, you can use that as well. And you're going to actually surface this app inside of SharePoint through iframes and through a few other techniques so that it's actually not even running on the SharePoint server. It's completely off box. And that's the model that Microsoft's pushing for the cloud. Okay, so none of your code is allowed to run on their server, period. That's the future. Okay, and that's the on-premise story as well, because people are trying to build on-premise solutions that are cloud ready, right? Business says, well, we know we're trying to get to Office 365, but we're 2 years out. Start building solutions that are cloud ready. Okay, that means we have to follow these models. All right. So building a SharePoint hosted app, you'll need the tools for Visual Studio 2012. If you're already using Visual Studio 2013, it's built in. But you'll just create a new app for SharePoint 2013, integrate it right into Visual Studio. The anatomy of the app looks something like this. You'll typically have pages, scripts, styles, and manifests. So this is like web developer, 2.0, kind of 101 here, right? We have HTML, we have CSS, and we have JavaScript. That's our development model. There's some other stuff that SharePoint does with like XML for features and the apps and all that other stuff that we're used to as SharePoint developers. But this is all kind of web development stuff, right? So HTML, there's still ASPXs. That doesn't mean you can do server-side code though. That does mean there are some controls available to you from Microsoft that you can use. One of them is there's like an allow iframing. I'll point it out. But mostly we're talking about CSS, JavaScript, and standard HTML. Why do you want to do this? Why is this valuable, right? One of the big things that I've found is the app upgrade process. It's really, really cool. What you can do is you build an app, you put it in your app catalog. Let's say it's version 1.0. We roll it out. We have, let's say we have a team site implementation at the company. We've built this feature that really is cool for team sites. We have 500 team sites. 100 of them take advantage of this app, and they start using this app. And we have a new feature that comes out. 20 of those say, I would love that feature. I need that feature. I need to upgrade my app. The other 90 say, I don't really need that feature. I'd rather just keep business as usual and stay on the current version we're on. You have no way to do that today. You have no way to manage that deployment. You can try to do it through sandbox solutions, and that might get you a little bit, but it's so tedious. You can try to do it through farm deployment, but that's going to be almost impossible. You can try like feature versions and things like that, but it's really, really very difficult. So what they've done with the app model is they've said, here's what you can do. You can upload your new version to the app catalog, and all the users are going to be notified in their site that a new version is available. When they go in and look at the app, it'll tell them, hey, a new version is available. You want to update it? And they can choose at that point. So you can actually have a scenario just like this, where site B is running 1.0.1.0, and site A is running 1.0.0.0. Same, because it's all built into that app web. It's kind of isolated into that site. So you can actually have multiple different versions sitting out there. Now this is a little scary, but at the same time, it's really, really powerful to be able to do this and to let the business decide when they upgrade. Right? So it's your app. Here's the new features. You can use them if you want. If you want to have an upgrade, all that's going to happen behind the scenes is they're going to deactivate and reactivate those features on your solution. Yeah. You can do some PowerShell for sure to do that kind of thing. Sure. Yeah, it's gonna actually cause like a brief outage on this feature deactivation reactivation. But the cool thing with all this app deployment, app upgrade, never an IIS reset is happening here, right? So all of this can happen during business hours. If you say, hey, we need to upload a new version of the app, sure, go at it. You're gonna create a new site and deploy the app to it, sure. That's all, no downtime whatsoever. You need to do an app upgrade, yeah, and then there might be a brief like feature deactivation, but you're not gonna have, someone's not gonna be able to not save their document.
So the experience is if somebody goes in while it's doing that, it'll say working on it. They'll get a screen of help, and it'll get a nice UI that says we're in the process.
It's very polite. SharePoint 2013 is extremely polite. You'll see working on it, and if you get an error, see sorry, those kinds of things. So yeah, very good. So let's talk a little bit about code. One thing I want to point out here as well is I put some resource links in here. If you're not familiar with Knockout when we're talking about it, I think it's going to say if you're on an older version, you need to, and it'll say upgrade to the latest. Yeah. So when you actually put it into the catalog only holds the latest version of your application. Yeah. Now you could go in and probably manually install that app at a different version level. But the way that the catalog kind of distributes apps, they always are trying to push you to the latest. All right. So we're going to talk about Knockout and Bootstrap. If you haven't heard about these things, Bootstrap is a CSS framework. It gives you like really nicely styled tables and headings and all kinds of stuff. It's just really good for prototyping and even kind of having a nice base start. This is actually built by Twitter, and they've open sourced it. Okay. So Knockout is the future, I think, of web development. This is built by a guy called Steve Sanderson, not a guy called, right? He actually works for Microsoft. He's on the ASP.NET team, and so that should tell you something that this is the direction Microsoft's heading. And if you're worried about your web development skills, you should be looking at Knockout. Okay, so the way that we bind objects in C#, we just do a data bind. We take an object, we pipe it into a table, and yeah, it's bound. Wonderful. Well, there's nothing like that with JavaScript to HTML, right? There's no way to take JavaScript data and bind it to an HTML table. Well, that's what Knockout does. Okay, so that's why. Here's the Gartner article I referenced. Reimagine SharePoint is a marketing campaign from, I think that's right. It might be reimaginespdev.com, and if it is, I'll update this before we send it out. But Reimagine SharePoint is a marketing campaign from Microsoft. There's about 5 videos right now that will, on that site that will walk you through how to convert a workflow to a SharePoint 2013 workflow, how to convert a web part to a SharePoint 2013 app part, And so they have some really good resources there. And the SharePoint 2013 Composites has about 97 sample solutions of how to build composite apps in SharePoint and Access Services and Visio services. Some really cool resources there. So take a look at that. All right, so I'm going to crank open Visual Studio, and hopefully everyone's good with that and not going to freak out. This is Visual Studio 2013 preview. Travis is going to leave. I'm out. So my app that I just opened, this is connected to Office 365. So I get prompted. It wants to know who I am, because if I was to hit F5 and do a deployment, this is actually going to retract the app from SharePoint Online and redeploy it. Now it's deploying it to a dev site. So I have a dev site collection that's isolated and I can just do development on all day long. But I actually don't, I'm doing SharePoint development without SharePoint installed on my laptop. This is like the moment we've all been waiting for, right? We don't have to log into a virtual, we don't have to do development, we don't have to manage a whole infrastructure. We can just deploy to a system. That's wonderful. So here we are, finally, we made it, right? So let's look at some of the elements of the solution here. Hopefully everybody can see this. I don't know if I can increase the size of this window, but we basically have the solution breaks down into these pieces. Content, which is the CSS. Okay. Here's Bootstrap. Like I said, it's just a Bootstrap. It's just a CSS framework. It's got a whole bunch of great styles for baselining the font sizes, the tables, etc. They do timing. Yeah. I see that, but what's their stop? All right, cool. We're good. All right, so we have a whole lot of baseline styles here, and so you'll see kind of how this manifests itself. But that table you saw earlier with the little headers and the buttons and all that, that was all Bootstrap. I wrote, for this whole app, I literally wrote one line of CSS. So that's great for me because I'm not really a designer, so I don't have to deal with some of that just to get a prototype out. So the next thing is images. All apps have to have an app icon. This is the app icon that ships. It's a beautiful app icon, right? This is the default app icon for all the apps. It's really nice. We also have our open tickets. This is actually our app part. So this is like what you would consider a web part today. An app part is a web part wrapper that just shows an iframe of an app. Okay, so this app part looks like this. It's called a client web part, and it's just the XML representation of that. And it's pointing to our page. So again, it's going to iframe this page into the web part. Okay? If you've worked with iframes or struggled with iframes, one of the challenges that you typically face is like you set a width and height on the iframe, and that's static. And so you're thinking, okay, I'm going to be able to put a static width and height, but that's not really good because my web parts sometimes grow, they shrink, right? Well, what Microsoft has done, and I'll show it to you, is they've actually built an API so that as an app, you can call back to the parent and say, hey, I need you to change your width. I need you to go from 300 to 400 wide. And you can actually control that within your app. And so this ticketing app has done that. And we have some sample code there. Next thing is our pages. So these are the two pages that are going to get deployed. We have an ASPX, a default ASPX, and we also have our open tickets. The open tickets is the app part. That's the iframed component. The default, that's my app page. That's kind of the default welcome page. So you can see welcome to SharePoint ticketing. And there's really, I don't have any server-side controls here. I'm following the standard kind of Microsoft practice with, still using kind of content placeholders, just not really, it's ASP.NET stuff here, right? So I have my additional page header, I have my title, and I have my main. But I can't add additional ASP.NET controls here because they're not, I can't have server-side code. So everything I've done, I've just done through HTML. All right, so the real magic is happening in our app part, this open tickets ASPX. So we'll come back to that in just one second. We also have all of our scripts that we're deploying. In this case, I'm deploying a whole bunch of jQuery as well as Bootstrap, which does have, it's not just a CSS framework, it also has some controls as well. I'm not using these controls, but it's got some really cool things around like modal dialogues and tab controls, navigation flyouts. It's got stuff like sliders and some different pieces there. So worth taking a look at. And here's our application, our actual app code. Now I'll kind of walk through this, but this is using JavaScript. If you've worked with it, is not object-oriented by nature. It's very much kind of just a scripting language. We have written this in using object-oriented kind of best practices. So this list is actually a function, right? There's the whole function, but it's an object. Okay, so this is going to be seen as an object. This little starting parenthesis, ending parenthesis, and then two random parentheses. It just seems like what is going on here? That's a self-executing function, and it actually executes and then assigns itself to this list. So even though this code looks maybe looks crazy if you're just a standard kind of scripting guy, this is object-oriented JavaScript. So we're taking a language that's not object-oriented, and we're forcing it into that so that we can actually have some maintainable code. Okay, and if you don't want to do this and write this craziness, you should look at TypeScript. TypeScript is what Microsoft has written a new language called TypeScript that compiles to JavaScript. It's really cool. It gives you namespaces. It gives you object-oriented programming. It gives you type-safe. It's a type-safe language, and it compiles down to JavaScript. So you can still, your application runs like normal because it compiles to JavaScript. It makes developing the code a lot faster. So, and here's what we're using for object inheritance. This little crazy prototype language. I mean, I'm not even going to get into this because you know, yeah, exactly, right? It's like I'm burning my eyes, but that's actually handling object inheritance through JavaScript. So, very good. The next thing we have, we're going to go back through this again, is the ticket instance. So this is actually our list. Okay, so it's going to communicate. SharePoint's going to pull down that schema, and it gives us a really nice design surface. If you haven't worked with SharePoint 2013, then you haven't seen, like, the new way to building lists is not all through XML. Even 2010 has some features around this, but it's improved. We can add a new field on the list. We can pick from the list of site columns. We can add site columns to our project, and they'll show up in here. And so building lists and list definitions and list templates is very, very easy through Visual Studio. So that's all we've done here is we've built an instance of a ticketing list that has these fields. All right? I've marked them whether they're required or not. I can build my custom views on the list. I can work with the list description. I can do it all through the UI. I don't have to write all this in XML. If I want to write XML, that's fine too. I should be able to come in here and open up this schema XML, and I can do it the old-fashioned way all day long. But
and there are some things you have to. There's some things that are not supported in Toolroom.
Sure. Yeah, there's some advanced stuff down here. Like if you want to create your custom forms and put in like URLs to custom new forms, you'd still have to do that through here. But yeah, yeah. It's the 80% rule of Microsoft, for sure. Very good. And then the last thing is the app manifest. So the app manifest actually defines some of the basic settings in the app, like your version number. This is how Microsoft's going to help manage the deployment and upgrade of the app. So you're going to define the version number. You're going to tell it what your start page is. You're going to tell it some standard tokens. Okay? And this is kind of like, okay, what's happening there? I'll show you in a second. But the app will actually, when the app gets called, it will pass query parameters on the query string for the URL. And your app can parse that, and that's how you actually communicate back with SharePoint through authentication. It's using, yeah, sorry. It's using OAuth to communicate that. So it's going to pass an access token. Thank you, David. All right, so let's look at some of the what's happening here in the open tickets. So here's where some of the magic's going on. All right, so the first thing that happens if we go and we look at our app is that you see I actually have a nice SharePoint header. So this app is not running within my SharePoint site. This could be running on an IIS server. This could be running on Apache server, like I was saying earlier. But this section at the top here, the back to school, this is the site name, the browse, all of these additional menus, even if I was running on Apache, I could still get that menu to come in. I could still make it look like my SharePoint environment. And I could even, if I had a special color theme on my SharePoint site, that color actually passes through to that menu bar. And so that's like, oh, okay, well, how's that happening? And it's not even in SharePoint. Well, what Microsoft has done is they've written a bit of JavaScript here. It comes with the SharePoint, comes with the template when you add this to the page. And it's actually building a CSS reference link based on the host site URL, and it's pulling this kind of this web helper, right? So it's pulling the default CSS, it's adding that, and it's grabbing the themable core V15. And so if I did have a theme applied, it's going to pull that as well. And so that's pretty cool. It's already pulling all that in for me. And so it actually just attaches that to the top of the window through the JavaScript. And now I have an actually themed app page. And it still feels like SharePoint. Even though I've left SharePoint and I'm inside my app, it still feels like SharePoint. So that's pretty cool. You don't have to do that. If you wanted to build an app that was entirely 100% your real estate, your screen, you could do that as well. You could take this little bit out and you wouldn't have to have their theming come over. So here's my table. That's all the code there is for actually binding and having the data come from the SharePoint list. So all this data bind, that's actually knockout. That's taking a JavaScript object and connecting it to an HTML entity. And so here I've said loop through each of the items in the collection, in the array, and for each of those items, I want a table row. So I might have 100 items, I might have one item, but I only have to template that HTML out one time. So if I want to add a new column, it's as simple as adding a new TD and getting that into my JavaScript object. I don't have to go and copy and paste that or modify a lot. So that looks like really simple HTML, but all the really magic is happening in that knockout layer. So here we're binding a pretty complex attribute. I'm actually saying I want to bind the attribute as the href, the link, but I need to start with this URL and I need to add the ID to it. So it's actually doing string concatenation inside of the binding. And so you can do some really fancy things with knockout as well. There's a whole lot of different binding options. You have like a visible binding where you can say, if the property is true, hide or show this element. So you can hide rows in a table. If there's a filter set, you can do some really interesting things like that. So that's really the kind of the magic of the HTML. In order to get to this point, we have to build a pretty complex JavaScript object, right, that has all this data in it. And in order to do that, we've written all that logic in this app.js. So let's take a look at that real quick. So our app.js, we have a list. The list has a collection of items, and that's just an array. So that's our JavaScript array. Inside that item array, what we're actually doing is, when we, this is kind of our nomenclature. We're still using the data bind language, just like we do server side. But what we're doing is, when we get the data back from SharePoint through our service, we're just looping through every item that we received in that response, and we're adding it to our items array. Okay, so that's all that's really happening. We get this object back, and then at some point down here, let's just show it. So we call the asynchronous command to SharePoint. We bind the items, and then we call this knockout.apply bindings. This is what tells knockout to say, take the HTML, take the JavaScript, match them up, and build out the result. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then the last thing we do is we resize the iframe, because we don't know how many records we bound. We could have bound 100 records to that table, and it might have changed the height of it. So we resize it, and that code just looks like this. We take the parent window and we send a message, and this is the format that Microsoft has defined as the standard. So we send a little XML message and we say, here's the sender ID that was told to us by Microsoft, so that there's some verification. Someone else can't just start resizing our windows, right? We have this verification sender ID, and we say resize the width and height of our window. Okay, so that's pretty simple code. We're using jQuery to calculate the width and height of the iframe body. So if the body's 500, the iframe is going to get resized to be 500. So it's really nice. It'll fit perfectly there. So that's all we do. Anytime we refresh the data, we resize the iframe. Pretty straightforward. So let's look at the some of the code here. All right, so here's our page. You can see at the top here, looks just like a standard page. We have default.aspx. I can go back to my site here, and our Open Tickets app is pulled up. I should be able to, let's do this. I'm just going to inspect this iframe here, and you'll see I have an iframe. That's all it is. Nice little iframe here, and then here's the URL to my app. So I can copy this, open it up in a new tab. Okay. So just to show there's no smoke and mirrors, that's the content that's getting iframed in, but it doesn't have the whole heading bar. It doesn't have any of the additional branding. So it's really quite, really that simple. Now, because this is all JavaScript, you're going to find yourself using more client-side development techniques and client-side development tools. So we have a JavaScript object called tickets list. It's actually an object. So instead of using Visual Studio to debug, we can actually use the browser's developer toolbar to do a lot of this debugging. So if I just type tickets list, I get that object back, and I can see, okay, well, I got an array of items, 1, 2, 3, 4 objects in that array. Well, guess what? I have 4 tickets up here, so that's really good. I could do tickets list dot items and grab the first item, and I can see exactly what's in that ticket. So now I can start kind of working and debugging my JavaScript, and I need to use these developer-side tools to do that. So I'm really working with it from this perspective. So the same thing with like CSS. I use this a lot. If I want to change the CSS property, I would grab the little cursor here and inspect the button. Say, yep, that's my button. I might right-click and say add an attribute, and I might say style width colon 500 pixels, and kind of adjust the CSS. So if I'm not, if I don't want to waste time doing a rebuild, I can do some things very quickly and then make those changes back into the code base. So the new technology around the client side, it's not, you can still use breakpoints. I can still go into my script. I can set breakpoints in here as well. So you still have full debugging support. And Visual Studio has integrated a lot of this stuff into Visual Studio for debugging. But Firefox, Chrome, IE, they all have these developer tools built in. So it's pretty cool. So any questions about app dev? And we have about a few minutes here. We're going to kind of open it up for questions. Cool.
Is there any concern about site proliferation with this? Because it looks like SP ticketing in the subsite under back to school, when you deploy it, it's not only creating a site in the store or catalog, but it's also creating a site in the destination subsite.
Yeah, so the nice thing is that if all of the customizations are within that app subsite. So if something happens and you say, you know what, we don't want this app anymore, you just blow the app away and the subsite's gone. The other nice thing is if something happens in the upgrade and the site doesn't upgrade well, that's just your app. That's not impacting the whole rest of the site. And so that's how they decided to isolate. I mean, some of these decisions still have to fit into the architectural confounds of SharePoint, and that's how they did it. But it's probably the best option of the options, right? The other thing that you could do is if you said, I don't want I'm going to deploy this site to everywhere. This app needs to go everywhere, right? Your other option is this. So let's go here. I'm going to go to eastridge.sharepoint.com/site/apps. This is our app catalog. This is what an app catalog looks like by default. We haven't really done anything special with it. You have apps that you've deployed. So we've got 2, sample app and a ticketing app. So these are actually deployed to the business, but also this is kind of a weird thing, so follow along here. If you deploy your app to the app catalog is a site. If you deploy your app to the app catalog as if you would deploy it anywhere else, it takes on a special property, okay? So this is the SP ticketing app that's been deployed to the app catalog. And if I click the ... on this, I get a new option called deployment. And what I can do from this is I can centrally tell every single site collection in my SharePoint environment that you should have this app. Okay? But it doesn't create an app web off of that site. It uses the app web off of the app catalog. Okay? But what that means, though, is if I have a list where I'm storing tickets, everybody shares the same list. They don't get their own copy of the data. They're using that centralized app. So that might be a good use case in some scenarios, but it also is kind of a weird. You just got to think, yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a weird use case, but it's a valuable one as well. So the nice thing is when you update that app, you update it once, right? Everybody gets the updates. So yeah, very good. Any other questions? Who's kind of freaking out about like client-side development and like the shift? Everybody's good. Everybody's like excited, like yeah, bring on the jQuery, bring on the JavaScript. So. Internally, we've kind of had that struggles because you always have people that are like, I'm a server-side guy. You know what I mean? I write back-end web services. I do integration. And then you have the other people like, oh, I'm kind of a client side. I'm a front end guy. You know, I have an eye for design. I like CSS, and you have that conflict. So we're trying to kind of like, everybody's a front end guy now. You know, yeah, you might be doing web service development, you might be doing some stuff on the back end, but this is the future right here. And if it's not pretty, they don't want it. And that's kind of like the way things are going. If it's not pretty, then it feels like it works, not as well. So
I feel like they've come back towards the ASP.NET development model, which is if you're kind of promised and went through the MSC, C++, and the ASP, and the .NET, and you kind of developer. Then you got into SharePoint, and it's kind of a step back. Then we're coming back to an ASP.NET development model where you can write, client-side code, you can develop or debug within IE, which I love.
Yeah.
Like you're showing the iteration within IE.
Yeah.
It's a really fun way to write code, and you're not rebuilding, redeploying, wait for the IS reset. Doing farm solutions is kind of tedious shit.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes, so I'm just going to open up and I'm going to start a new SharePoint app just so you guys can kind of see what this looks like. So I'm just going to create a new project. This is off the script, so if it fails miserably, we blame the demo demons. But I'm just going to create a SharePoint app. Just call it 4. Say OK. So this is underneath C#, Office, SharePoint, and Apps. So that's where it's going to be. If you are on Visual Studio 2012, there is an add-in. I have the link in the presentation. You need to install that first. It's going to ask me where I'm going to deploy this for debugging purposes. And so I've got my own site collection online. Every developer gets their own site collection. That's just how we've decided to do it. We've got a naming convention for that. And I'm choosing SharePoint hosted. If I did auto-hosted, then I would need to that would actually deploy it to Azure. It would spin up a SQL Azure instance if I needed one. It would spin up a web worker instance in Azure, and they would start charging me money for that, right? So if you're an MSDN subscriber, you do get $100 of Azure services a month, and it'll hit your quota, and then it'll just shut off, so you won't get charged. But if you're not, and you put your credit card in, be careful. We had one of our guys that went to a training on Azure, and they set up just a simple like poker dealer web service. And next month he got a bill for $1,000. And we called him up. We're like, hey, we need to shut that down and cancel that. And they didn't charge us, but so provider hosted is if I was going to deploy this to IIS, it could run on any server. So we're just going to choose SharePoint hosted to finish there. All right, it's going to prompt me again. Office 365 is very secure. You should have no problems putting your data in there as many times as I get prompted. So, all right. Should be going there. Let's try it. Try it again. Got it. Okay. All right. So same kind of project structure. Nothing fancy here, right? We have our app CS. Got our pages. We have the default initially, and the sample code of what it's going to do is it's going to get the context from SharePoint. It's going to get the current user context, all client-side-object model, and it's going to right here, when the page is loaded, this is using jQuery, so wait for the page to load, then call get username. And that's going to execute a query against the SharePoint object model, pull that data back, and just change the message to hello and then my name. So the default message will say initializing here. This is the ID message. And after it's done initializing, and after this code is run, it should say hello. And it's just a hello world app, right? That's the default app that you get here. So I'm going to say debug. Start. Hit F5. I haven't done anything to it. So it's installing the app for SharePoint. We're going to watch the output down here. All right, so it's installing the app. It's uploading the app to SharePoint, doing the installation. It still uses like CAB files, if you're, WSP format, but there's actually a new format called .app, which is the WSP plus this app manifest XML combined into this app format. So this guy's going to get deployed. He's opening up on SharePoint Online. And here's my app. Hello, Corey Peters. And we got the app. Now, if I go back to the site, my dev site, can see I've got the app showing here, SharePoint App 4. I have apps in testing here. So it kind of gives you a nice little list where these are your apps you're working on, this is the current version they're on, this is the last time it was deployed. And so it maintains a lot of that for you just from kind of an F5 deployment. And if I want to get to the app, let's say I decide to delete this off the nav, where's my app? It's going to be, I think you can click on this, you can, yeah. Or you can go into site contents and it shows up here. Here's my new app. So that's our icon, right, the default X. And so I would typically want to deploy a nice looking icon like this one, but I can go in there and access my app, and it's pretty nice. For the app parts, when I edit the page and add a web part, I think we're right at time. The new option here is the app part. Okay, so when I say insert, I have an app part and a web part. When I insert an app part, here's my open tickets app part. So it has its own little icon that you can customize. You can have a description and a title just like you normally would, and you can still build web part properties on these app parts as well. So you can still have the properties panel. You can still customize it. But what's neat is those web part properties, what Microsoft does is it rips them off the web part and just passes them along as query string parameters to your URL inside the iframe. So it's nothing new here from a technology perspective, but they've snapped all this together and given a really good developer experience within Visual Studio. So that's kind of the standard. You can do that today. You can go set up a 365 trial. Just go to office365.com, sign up for a trial, personal trial, no credit card. You'll get 30 days. Download the Visual Studio 2013 preview, and just create a new project and hit F5 and see what it does and play around with it. I mean, everybody can do this. You'll get emails and Microsoft will bug you and say, hey, your trial is going to expire. Just ignore them and they'll delete it. But it's fine. I mean, you can go play around. We set up trials all the time. It's great. It's not a sales talk. It's not a sales talk, right? Use their resources. They're giving them away, right? So it's pretty cool. Any other questions?